I am going to present today on the impostor phenomenon. And I started doing research in this area a number of years ago, simply because when I was introduced to the concept, I was like, oh, that sounds like me. And I didn't realize for many years, I had no words and no concepts to explain my cognitive processes that I go through and all of the hoops and things. And then when I was introduced to this concept, it made a lot of sense.
You just heard Loretta McGregor from Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, Arkansas, as she delivered her STP presidential address at the 2024 American Psychological Association in Seattle, Washington, for episode 205 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter.
Thank you so much for coming again. Seriously. I am going to present today on the impostor phenomenon. And I started doing research in this area a number of years ago, simply because when I was introduced to the concept, I was like, oh, that sounds like me. And I didn't realize for many years, I had no words and no concepts to explain my cognitive processes that I go through and all of the hoops and things. And then when I was introduced to this concept, it made a lot of sense. Now that I've been researching it, my question has become, how do we create ways to help people who experience the imposter phenomena? I've been looking at it with other variables that other researchers have said are associated with it. And I'm working my way, hopefully, to suggesting some type of intervention. Hopefully that's going to be beneficial not only to faculty members and staff members and whoever else, but more importantly to my students, so that if we can help them early on to deal with and to adequately find ways to cope with the imposter phenomena, that it will help them in the long run and they will not have to experience some of the, oppressive thoughts and doubts that I've had to experience over the years. So with that, I'm going to start with the original researchers, Clance and Imes, in 1978, came up with the concept of the imposter phenomena. And many of you've heard of this before. And you know that for individuals who experience this, they are people who are successful and fairly good at what they do, but they often experience this level of anxiety that suggests to them that other people are going to somehow find out that they are really fooling them and they're fooling themselves and they're not as good and somebody is going to out them as a fraud. These thoughts can be oppressive to the point where the person then starts to self-sabotage. And that is what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about students who they are very successful, they're very good, have a lot of potential, but they flame out because of feelings of being an imposter. The original research looked at women, and it wasn't that they weren't interested in men and how they felt. It's just that the original researchers were clinicians. And in their research, they noticed that they had clients who tend to have these same kinds of concerns, these things in common, and they all happen to be women. And so, talking among themselves, they decided to look at this from a clinical and a research perspective. So they started looking at undergraduate and graduate women. They looked at women with PhDs from a variety of disciplines, professional women, and all of these women did not consider themselves successful. They thought that they were intellectual imposters. The two researchers decided to create a questionnaire. And yes, they did validate the questionnaire and norm it. And with the questionnaire, they then started giving the questionnaire to their clients who expressed feelings of being an imposter to see what they had in common. Now, as I said here, the imposter phenomena, the phrase itself was coined in 1978. Recently, probably in the last, 3 or 4 years, you seem to hear a lot about this in the general population and in the press. And so I looked at some of the press. I looked at different newspaper articles, different articles in magazines, looked at some of the kind of popular media that's out there, and it seems to be everywhere. Everybody now has some thoughts about the imposter phenomena. But the thing that struck me the most is that people have started to drift from it being called the imposter phenomena to the imposter syndrome. And quite often you'll see and hear people talk about the imposter syndrome. This is one of my pet peeves, I'll admit it, which is why the slide is here. The original authors did not call this a syndrome. They did not call this a syndrome because a syndrome, based on the definition here, is a set of symptoms and signs that are usually due to a single cause and together indicate a physical or mental disorder. The original authors never intended to have the imposter phenomena considered to be a mental disorder. Additionally, the authors in their writing suggest that there are multiple causes that can explain the imposter phenomena. So it's not a syndrome, and as such, it's not a mental disorder. There's no clinically significant disturbances. And again, the authors never intended to suggest that there were.
Macmillan Psychology's Achieve for Psychology is here to help you build academic integrity in the classroom, because it's not just about cheating, it's about increasing positive behaviors. Achieve helps you build academic integrity in the classroom through goal setting and reflection surveys. These frequent low-stakes assignments prepare students for exams and thus reduce course stresses that can lead to cheating. Achieve's goal setting and reflection surveys also help students set personal goals and provide instructors meaningful ways to check in with students and their goals. Again, helping students feel more comfortable in class and with study materials helps instructors keep academic dishonesty out of the classroom. Preview how Achieve helps build academic integrity in the classroom at macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions.
Phenomena best fits this because it's an observable event or physical occurrence and an occurrence or entity that defies explanation. And the researchers themselves and researchers up to this point, they really cannot give you one explanation for why people who are successful feel this way. And when you talk to people, you'll actually find that it may be a variety of things. And it could also be situationally influenced. This is my contribution to the original authors. I beg of thee, please do not refer to this as the imposter syndrome evermore. Never again. It is the imposter phenomenon. And if you find someone and they say, oh, I have the imposter syndrome, just gently remind them that it is a phenomenon. So most of the recent research from 78 forward has really been conducted with college students. But there is research out there that looked at individuals who are in different employment arenas. The research still suggests that it is more common in women than men, but let me remind you, individuals are completing self-report questionnaires. And so the self-report questionnaires suggest that it occurs more often in females than males. But again, it's self-report. Okay. We also find that there is a difference in terms of ethnic groups and that it tends to be more common in individuals who are also from marginalized communities. The characteristics of the imposter phenomena, as you can see here, and all of these have been studied to some degree by a variety of researchers. When I first started looking at this, I simply wanted to see the frequency of occurrence in college students. I wanted to see if there were difference in terms of ethnic groups, and I wanted to see if there was a difference in terms of gender. I then moved on to looking at the literature that linked the imposter phenomena to some of the big 5 personality characteristics. And one of the things that I did is I looked at it in terms of also the relationship between IP and depression, because there had been previous research done to suggest that the cognitive thought processes of individuals who experience the imposter phenomena were very similar to some of the types of negative cognitive processes that occur in individuals who have mild depression. And the study I did in 2008, I actually found there was a relationship between the imposter phenomena and depression, the Beck Depression Inventory. So let's talk about the scales themselves that I'm using in this research. Because in this research, I have moved on from looking at the relationship between IP and depression, and now I'm looking at the relationship between the imposter phenomena and perfectionism. Can anybody think maybe why I would think there's a relationship? I'll take a sidebar while you're thinking, and I'll tell you a story. When I got in last night, as I always do, I'm unpacking my little stuff. I hang my stuff up, and they have to be hung in a certain order. And then I'm putting my little toiletries on the counter, and I rearranged the things on the counter 3 times, 4 times. They had to have the right balance so that when I reach for them, see, some of you all know what I'm talking about. You're nodding. See? That is a characteristic of perfectionism. And for me, I'm self-revealing here. Even though there have been times where I felt like, oh my God, I am an imposter. What am I doing? I'm going to screw this up. I still work on it to the point of over obsessing. It has to be perfect. It has to be darn near perfect, if not perfect. Now, I'm in recovery from that because I've learned, and I have learned that I can also accept my mistakes and grow from them. So I gave a similar presentation to this back in April at the Southwestern Psychological Association. And in that presentation, I actually realized on a slide that I had misspelled something. And I caught it in the middle of the presentation. I was doing my thing, and then I looked around and I said, oh, there's a typo. Inside, I just died. But then I said, okay, this is okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I said, okay, so here's a perfect example of what you should do if you're an imposter and you make a mistake like this. You give yourself time to actually mourn the incident, and then you tell yourself, time's up, and then you move on. And that's actually what I did. And I find when I make mistakes like that now, the imposter in me says, you idiot. But then the rational part says, okay, Loretta, you made a mistake. They're going to see that you're human. The other part of me says, but you're not. And the other part says, but you are. So we have that you aren't for a little bit. And I'm like, what am I doing? But it's a perfect, I think, opportunity for me to demonstrate to the people that I'm presenting to, as well as my students, that yes, you can feel like an imposter, but also feel the need to be perfect. And neither one of those are really a good thing. So the imposter phenomena scale, the one that I use is the Clance imposter phenomena scale. It has 20 questions. There are others out there, but I use this because it's the original and I like it. And she also gave me permission to change it if I wanted to. So the way it's measured is it's on a scale from 1 to 100. And anyone who scores less than 40, they're not considered an imposter. They don't have feelings of imposter that they really demonstrate. Individuals here who have a score higher than 81 are considered to be extreme imposters. I'm not going to tell you my original score, but it was not that low. It was not 81. For this particular research, though, I found that I actually had to recode the questionnaire when I was analyzing the data because I really didn't have a lot of people in this group. Now, I'm using college students in my sample. Most of my college students had some feelings of being an imposter. And so what I did is I actually took the first two, the moderate and the few, and collapsed them together. The Big Three perfectionism scale is the scale that I use to measure perfectionism. It is based on the Big Five personality inventory, and it has 45 questions. It has 10 lower order perfectionism facets. So those 45 questions can be arranged into 10 lower order facets. And then those 10 lower order facets can be organized into 3 higher order global factors. So in my research, I am looking at the global factors.
Hi folks, this is Garth, and I want to tell you about an intro psych book from Sumo Learning. That's SOOMO. The book is called Psychology in the Real World by author Jennifer Harper. Sumo and Harper have taken seriously the APA-IPI recommendation that scientific inquiry and research methods should be the foundation for all content areas. So they built research spotlight activities into every chapter with focus on identifying and evaluating scientific claims, which is the applied stuff
that we all want our students to be able to do coming out of this course. It's got LMS integration and auto grading and supplements like slides and test questions and notes. And it's affordable at only $50. So check it out. Go to sumolearning.com. That's SOOMO learning.com and get a preview of psychology in the real world.
So the lower order factors are here. And again, what you do is you take those lower order factors and you actually combine some of them to make the 3 global factors. And anyone who's interested in which factors go together, I have that information that I'll be more than happy to share with you at the end of the presentation. The 3 global factors are rigid perfectionism, self-critical, and narcissistic. And you go, what's the difference? With rigid perfectionism, this is described as individuals who must have things done in a particular order, and they do not like to deviate from it, ever. With self-critical perfectionism are individuals who themselves feel like they have to be perfect in everything they do. And when they are not perfect, because they are human, no, they're not. Yes, they are. When they are not perfect, they then criticize themselves and chastise themselves for not being perfect. And then narcissistic perfectionism, these are individuals who not only believe that they should be perfect, but they believe also other people should be perfect, and they believe other people think that they should be perfect. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? So, I'm so sorry. What did you say, Eric? Oh, that's what I thought. You're on mute. Oh, I meant to print this out, and I actually forgot to bring copies. But these are the means, standard deviations, and the MANOVA for the IP scale, as well as the perfectionism scale. So basically what I did is I ran a MANOVA to see if they influenced each other based on the different levels. The different levels of the IP and the 3 orders of the perfectionism scale. And I did find that rigid perfectionism changed based on the level. So notice, individuals who had a moderate imposter score, their mean score on rigid perfectionism is 23.8. And it goes up based on their level of imposterism or feelings of being an imposter. Self-critical, same thing. Their scores for perfectionism go up. And I think it's really interesting. There's a pretty big difference between moderate and frequent, but frequent and intense are closer. And notice, this is statistically significant at the less than 0.001. There was no statistical significance for narcissistic perfectionism. So then I decided to do a hierarchical regression with the 3 global factors and the IP score to see, okay, does there seem to be a moderating effect among the 3 factors when it comes to their overall perfectionism score and their overall imposter score? And what I found is that, yes, with self-criticism seems to be a moderating factor for their imposter score. In other words, their level of feeling like an imposter is also influenced by how self-critical they are about themselves when it comes to perfectionism. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. that if you are self-critical and you're very self-critical, that's going to make you feel more like an imposter and vice versa. So the multiple regression resulted in a main moderating effect for the global factors of self-perfectionism and IP score. There was a small interaction between the global factors of self-critical and rigid perfectionism and IP. It was at the 0.05 level, and it was a very small interaction. I am wondering if there's not some overlap between the two factors of self-critical and rigid perfectionism that's being picked up on when you combine them together. Or if that makes any sense. What is moderation? Because I'm throwing these words around. When it comes to a moderating effect, this is a third variable that influences the relationship between the IV, that is the predictor, and the outcome variable. The strength or direction of the relationship between the predictor and outcome variable changes depending on the level of the moderating variable. And that's what we see. So the level of your self-criticism, that is how much or how high you score or how low you score, also influences indirectly the level of your imposter or how much you feel like an imposter. So why does this matter? You're like, yeah, you've given us all this stuff. Why does it matter? Because self-critical perfectionism is characterized by people who set these excessively high standards for themselves, and they become overcritical of their own performance and their own ability. People with this particular trait, they then often have this harsh internal dialogue, again, of chastising themselves and criticizing themselves for not meeting their expectations, but their expectations quite often are unreal. They're unrealistic expectations that they've set for themselves. This kind of perfectionism is associated with things like anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. And I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed that a lot of my students who are coming into college now have very high levels of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. What if part of it is due to this self-critical perfectionism? And just talking to my students, I think a lot of it is due to this self-critical perfectionism. My students, I've had students tell me before that if they fail on something, they think their life is going to end. And they literally think this is the end of their life. This is the end of their world. And I'm like, no, this means you just learn what you did wrong and then you try not to do it again, or you learn a better way to do it. But they are so afraid of failure. I've never seen students in my 30 years of teaching who were so afraid of failure. If a student gets a B on a test, I've had students literally sit in class and cry because they got a B. And I'm like, you should be happy with a B in this class, sweetie, because this ain't no joke. This is statistics. And this was your first exam? I want to tell them, look at your friend over there. They made an F. Do you see them crying? HIPAA says we can't say things like that. Or FERPA. Sorry, FERPA says you can't out people like that. Although I remember when they used to put grades and names up on the door and you go check. Okay, I digress. IP scores. Notice high IP scores are also related to high levels of anxiety. And then when I talk about both of these, IP scores, and when I talk about perfectionism, the relationship to anxiety then leads to associated health outcomes. I also have more students now than I've ever had before who come into college at 17, 18, and 19 with hypertension. And part of it is because they're so stressed. But then why are they so stressed? Because they feel like they need to be perfect. Why do they feel like they need to be perfect? I don't know. But in addition to feel like they need to be perfect, they are also afraid of failure, and they believe that they are failures. Can somebody help me figure out where this came from? Because I really don't know. And I just find it interesting. So, how do we help our students? They come in with these types of disorders. Oh, and they also seem to have ulcers or acid reflux, like at 19. As I said earlier when I started this, my desire is to find a way to help my students who experience feelings of being an imposter and have these feelings of perfectionism to help them deal with it more effectively. I have played around with this idea of what would happen if I told students who scored high on the imposter phenomena and on the perfectionism scale. What if I told them that they scored high, told them some of the possible health outcomes associated with it, and then maybe offered some coping mechanisms? How would that help in the long run? I'm still toying with that idea because for me, I really want this to be applied. I want it to be useful. I want it to be helpful. So that's what I'm working on. I have the early makings of another research project that would measure the imposter phenomena as well as these feelings of perfectionism. And in my head, I've got 3 groups where one of them, I tell them that they have this, and I then introduce some type of intervention. The second group, I tell that they have this, and I don't introduce an intervention. And then the third group, my control group, we just sit around and hold hands and have popcorn and laugh. So that's rolling around up here somewhere. But what can we do? That's the IP awareness training part that I'm working on. And I've only found a couple of other studies that have tried this with mixed results. Cognitive training. There's also research to suggest that cognitive training is a good way to help individuals who are experiencing these characteristics. That is more clinical and outside of my area of expertise. So I leave that to people who know what they're doing. Same thing is true with resiliency training. That's a more clinical approach to it, teaching people about how to be hardy and more resilient. That's clinical. I am not a clinician. So anyone out there, if you're a clinician and you want to do this, I will be more than happy to do the statistics for you. Rethinking mistakes versus failure. Again, maybe helping students understand, and this is a hard one because I teach first-year students, but helping students understand the value of making mistakes. There's a session, I think it's a session listed tomorrow that sort of talks about this that I'm interested in. And then again, I will send them to my clinician friends for therapy because I'm not a clinician. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. I appreciate it. I will open the floor for questions, but I also want to thank some individuals. I want to thank my former student and future colleague one day, actually very soon. I think he graduates in May of next year with his PhD in quantitative analysis and ed psych. So he was one of my former students, undergraduate and graduate, Hiroki Matsuo. My colleague and also former student, who really is my colleague, our offices are right next door to each other, for being part of what I call my IP posse. So we have a pact that when we start verbally expressing our feelings of being an imposter, that we slap each other around and bring us back to reality. Actually, we say, okay, your imposter is showing. I need you to reel it in. And then, who I met earlier this year, who she decided to put these two together, and she came up with a phrase called imposse. So, thank you very much.
Psych Sessions can do what it does because of listeners like you. We want to thank you for your support over the years in our mission to get more free professional development to all teachers of psychology around the world. If you want to support us further by making a tax-deductible donation, please head to psychsessions.org/donations. Thanks for listening.